In this question, we're looking at a situation in which the government had a budget balance of zero, that they were borrowing nothing. But now the government has decided that they have wanted to increase education spending by $200 billion, and they're going to do that by taking on debt. So how does that impact the equilibrium interest rate and quantity of loanable funds in the loanable funds market? Well, we know then that if the government is borrowing $200 billion that it wasn't doing before, that the demand curve for loans is going to shift to the right by $200 billion at every single interest rate because the government is now borrowing more. And so, as a result, the demand curve would shift out and it would look like this. This shift in demand to the right is going to cause the equilibrium point to move along the supply curve from point E up to this higher new equilibrium point. So we see that the interest rate is going to rise from 10% to 12%. And we're going to see the quantity of loanable funds increase as well from $500 billion to $600 billion. As a result, we know that some private investment has been crowded out, and we can see that on the graph. We know that the demand curve has shifted by $200 billion because that's how much government is borrowing. Everything else was the same. So we know that at this 12% equilibrium interest rate, that total borrowing was $600 billion. The government borrowing is $200 billion. So from $400 to $600 billion, this distance here is government borrowing. That anything from 0 to 400 is private investment. We also know from the previous bit of information the government wasn't borrowing before. So before the government decided to run a budget deficit, the $500 billion in total borrowing was all private in nature. And so there's this section between $400 billion and $500 billion that was private and is now public borrowing or government borrowing. This little area in here, this $100 billion, is what we call the result of crowding out. So the government's borrowing has chosen to crowd out $100 billion worth of private investment.